We've all seen multiple presentations of some large studies in follicular lymphoma that may or may not be moving the field forward. The GALLIUM study. What was the GALLIUM study and what did we learn from it?
So in the GALLIUM study, this was a study that was actually presented within the last year, and was, I guess, an update was presented at our recent Lugano meeting, looking at upfront or untreated patients with follicular lymphoma and randomizing them, pretty simple design, 1-to-1, to get rituximab plus chemo versus obinutuzumab plus chemo. And the chemo arms could be either bendamustine, CHOP, or CVP. So it was pretty simple design, basically switching out the monoclonal antibody between the two arms.
Yeah. And what did we learn from that study?
Well, we learned that you can, sort of use obinutuzumab with some of these regimens safely. It may add value in terms of PFS. At the time when the data was presented, there was no difference in overall survival. We learned also that when you combine obinutuzumab with bendamustine and give it as maintenance, there's increased toxicities beyond what we've seen with rituximab. So again, there will be some individual patient that may benefit from this combination, others may not be their best option. So there'll be, I think, choices to use obinutuzumab plus CVP. It wouldn't be wrong. Obinutuzumab plus R-CHOP wouldn't be wrong. I would not use obinutuzumab plus bendamustine. I would use rituximab with bendamustine.
Yeah, that observation, I still haven't really gotten my hands around it, because in the GALLIUM trial, which I presented at ASH a couple of years ago, it was bendamustine versus bendamustine obinutuzumab in rituximab refractory patients with a survival benefit from the combination arm and no increase in toxicity. So we have multiple studies showing no increase on toxicity from bendamustine and CD20s, including obinutuzumab. So I just don't know what to make of the GALLIUM trial.
In a way, data doesn't fit true, but also remember that when you treat patients in relapse setting, people tend to tolerate toxicities more than the frontline setting. They may be underreported, I think, and
there were more deaths too.
That's right, in the frontline.
Yeah.
Yes, right. But in the relapse setting, people tend to underreport probably because they expected, they can live with it. In the frontline, I think people tend to watch these patients very carefully and tend to report the toxicity more carefully. But I agree with you. I mean, it's in the relapse setting, it was not alarming. But now that what we know from the frontline setting, I think we have to look back again and see whether maintenance obinutuzumab after bendamustine would be also a reasonable option to every patient. I think some patients will be, but at least you need to watch these patients carefully, make decisions whether you want to continue with obinutuzumab or do something else.
It looked like that most of the excess deaths that we saw with the obinutuzumab plus bendamustine occurred late. Interestingly, it occurred during, as Anas mentioned, occurred during the maintenance arm. And one thing they had done in this study, in several patients, they had monitored their T cell levels after they received bendamustine, and you saw that many patients who received bendamustine, and I think we've all kind of known about this, have a kind of prolonged immunosuppression that continued after they finished treatment into the maintenance arm. So it's unclear. And one other thing is that the excess deaths were seen both with Rituxan and with obinutuzumab during the maintenance following bendamustine. What I find, as you mentioned, is that in other studies, including the BRIGHT study, including the STEEL study, it's even if patients are not monitored, that we didn't see a signal with regards to mortality, excess mortality in the bendamustine arm in those studies. In the GALLIUM trial, there were more older patients that were on the bendamustine arms. Not significant, but there were slightly more patients that were in their 70s and 80s in those arms. Maybe that caused excess deaths. In addition, you can hypothesize that if you knew that patients were going to get bendamustine, they were probably sometimes patients that were less healthy went onto those arms compared to R-CHOP. So there may have been some patient selection in the process, but I don't think you can argue with the T cell numbers. Really, there was definitely immunosuppression that lasted after you stopped bendamustine. So what I take out of that study is that patients who I'm going to give bendamustine plus obinutuzumab or Rituxan, you have to follow them closely. You have to give them prophylaxis if you suspect that you're going to have.
What's your practice, Bruce? Let me ask you. What do you do with this data? How do you use it in your practice?
Well, we have been using either BR or R squared up front. And for those patients who didn't get B up front, we're doing the GALLIUM regimen BO in the relapse setting. Of course, we try and put all the patients on clinical trials without chemotherapy, but that's our paradigm.
Right. But once obinutuzumab is expected to be approved for frontline, how would you use it?
I don't plan on using it, not because of this, but because of the GALLIUM results. That yes, there was they met their endpoint for PFS, but there was no survival benefit, and the toxicity, no matter what you looked at, was greater with the obinutuzumab. So it just, to me, doesn't seem like enough information to change my paradigm yet. And you?
As I said, I mean, it's, I think, a discussion point. It's not approved yet, so I haven't used it outside the clinical trials yet, but we'll have to learn from the long-term follow-up.
I think that I probably will use it in the front line with bendamustine or CHOP based upon the PFS curves. I agree with overall survival, there's no difference yet, and that's going to take longer time, but it's still, I mean, I think that we have to, at least most of us agree, it's a randomized study and they met its primary endpoint. Not that that should always be the trigger, but the primary endpoint of PFS should lead, if you follow these curves out, to a 3-year prolongation in PFS in the obinutuzumab arm, and it's hard for me to argue with.
Then let me throw this at you. Be prepared to duck. Since most of the troublesome adverse effects occurred during maintenance, would you use maintenance?
I would not. Yeah, so
Okay.
that's, I think that, again, this is speculating as it's not FDA approved yet, but if I was going to use it in combination, I probably would not do maintenance.
And again, haven't been a big fan of maintenance to start with, yes. So, but just because the toxicities occurred during maintenance doesn't mean that maintenance is responsible for it. It could be just delayed side effects from induction therapy.
That's possible, definitely.
The MAGNIFY and the AUGMENT trials, one of our favorite regimens?
Yeah, so what Bruce is talking about is there are 2 studies, potential registration studies for lenalidomide, rituximab, or R-squared in relapsed follicular. The first is the MAGNIFY trial where everybody's getting R-squared. And then basically the study's looking at maintenance either with rituximab or with R-squared. And the AUGMENT study is a phase 3 study where patients, one arm is getting, this is again all relapsed follicular, half the patients are getting R-squared, half the patients are getting rituximab as a single agent. The AUGMENT study, we may see some data here within the next 6 to 12 months, depending on how the study is accruing, et cetera. And the MAGNIFY study, I think, is still quite a ways out from reading. We saw some preliminary data at the national meetings this year from the MAGNIFY trial, but that really was just the results from the induction arm. They looked at basically patients, well, they looked at the overall response. They also looked at patients who were double refractory, that means refractory to an alkylator as well as rituximab, as well as patients in this group that we've been talking about. These patients have progressed within 2 years. And it looked like R-squared in both of those groups had a response rate over 60%. I have a little bit of a problem because these are interim results from an ongoing phase 3 trial. It's hard to know, again, how that's going to translate into with regards to PFS when you put patients on different maintenance. It's a subset analysis of a study. It's not part of the primary endpoint. So I take that as again, evidence that the regimen probably does work in a group of patients that are relapsed, but I would not change practice based upon these early results from the MAGNIFY trial. And the AUGMENT study, there's nothing published yet. So.